Good day to you, and welcome to Fascinating. I'm your host, Rick, from planet Vulcan. My ongoing mission on planet Earth to search for signs of intelligence and to encourage its spread. In this essay, we explore a fascinating earthling concept known as property, all the way from the biblical injunction, "Thou shalt not steal," which of course implies property, down to present-day thoughts on the subject. Contributing editor Mahalo Kumela submits the following. Here are some quotes from famous people on the subject of property. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote, "What we call real estate, the solid ground to build a house on, is the broad foundation on which nearly all the guilt of this world rests. A man will commit almost any wrong. He will heap up an immense pile of wickedness, as hard as granite, and which will weigh as heavily upon his soul to eternal ages, only to build a great, gloomy, dark-chambered mansion for himself to die in, and for his posterity to be miserable in." Robert Ingersoll wrote, "Don't you know that if people could bottle the air, they would? Don't you know that they would allow thousands and millions to die for want of breath if they could not pay for air?" Bertrand Russell, himself a wealthy aristocrat, wrote, "It is preoccupation with possessions, more than anything else, that prevents men from living freely and nobly." On the other hand, many people believe that property is one of humankind's most civilizing practices. As Robert Frost wrote, "Good fences make good neighbors." So who are you going to believe? Those who say that property came into being through intelligent, though evil, design, or those who say that property came about through a process of evolution and that it benefits pretty much everyone? I propose to demonstrate that the so-called thinkers quoted above were looking at the world through shit-colored glasses, and that they were motivated by something other than the desire to make sense, some sort of deep-seated, unreasoning animus. Let us then examine the concept of property more broadly and deeply and see if we can make sense of the concept. The notion of property appears to have evolved along with an alternative notion, which is hierarchy. Each of these notions is a way of dealing with a problem that is central to human existence, namely that there is and probably always will be an insufficient supply of valued things to satisfy everyone's wants fully. This is the definition of scarcity, not to be confused with shortage, which is a distinctly different concept and which means that there is an insufficient supply at a particular price. In a social order defined by hierarchy, think of feudalism or life on a plantation, authority based on rank preempts the choices of lower-ranked person. The lord and master dictates who gets what for people of lesser rank. In a hierarchical society, you have takers and you have victims. In a social order defined by property, contractual arrangements among people who are equal by custom and or under the law determine who gets what, under a system of pricing. In a property-based society, there are traders rather than givers and takers. The quotations we looked at above represent the thoughts of some of those who have speculated that perhaps we could have a functioning society without either property or hierarchy. They claim to believe that in an ideal world, people could exist by simply sharing what they produce. Think of John Lennon's Imagine. This sounds nice, but it fails to address the problem of scarcity. In a society without either ownership or authority, how would scarce resources be rationed? You cannot just assume the problem away and make lofty pronouncements about how everyone has a right to as much stuff as they need when they need it. If you were to add up everyone's needs, it would inevitably exceed how much stuff there is. Some have proposed that to make attainment of the ideal of common ownership more practicable, The state might own the means of production on behalf of the people and engage in top-down economic planning. Experiments along these lines in the recent past have, however, consistently and without exception created only poverty, tyranny, misery, and early death for the little people unfortunate enough to have been part of the experiments. The reasons for the failures of these experiments are now well understood, even if not universally accepted by the diehards, and lead to the conclusion that such a solution can never work. It seems to me that proponents of common ownership are guilty of the commonly encountered means and ends fallacy. That is, the idea that we can choose the ends and with sufficient authority force the ends into existence, whereas in truth we can only choose means directly, after which processes of evolution will determine the ends. And as for the idea that sharing is a viable substitute for hierarchy or property, it's also pretty certain that these thinkers have not spent much time around children. If you have spent time around children who have been taught that sharing is a major virtue, you have to have noticed that they are far more likely to apply the principle of sharing to other kids' stuff than to their own stuff. Until the advocates of common ownership inhabiting our ivory towers and our attic garrets come up with a workable method for coming to grips with scarcity, their arguments cannot be considered to have merit. And we need to recognize that their diagnoses and their prescriptions suffer from the further defect that they are based on intelligent design thinking rather than on evolutionary thinking. Denotatively, the concept of property has a simple and straightforward meaning. Connotatively, there are multiple meanings. The word property conjures up different visions for different people. The simple and straightforward meaning is that property represents an agreement among people in a community to recognize and respect the exclusive right of another community member to use and dispose of some tangible or intangible asset. If a person or some other legal entity, such as a corporation, has such a recognized right, we say that the person or legal entity owns it. Things are seldom quite as simple in practice as described above, of course, because some uses of assets might create incidental effects, also known as externalities, which then must become part of the equation. In other words, actions an owner might take for the purpose of creating private benefits can create social costs. Think, for example, of adding a second story to your house, which is great for you, but might block your neighbor's view. It's likewise true that actions aimed at creating private benefits can create social benefits. Think, for example, of planting flowers and shrubs around your house, which is great for you and which your neighbors will also enjoy for free. The brilliant UCLA economist Harold Demsetz made a valuable seminal contribution to thinking about the evolution of property rights. In a 1967 paper, Toward a Theory of Property Rights, he demonstrated how private ownership can evolve from communal ownership as a way of dealing with externalities that arise from the common use of a resource such as land that is being used for hunting and gathering. To support his thesis, he cites a case study of Indian tribes in Labrador by anthropologist Eleanor Burke Leacock. He shows how and why ownership by individuals and families came into being in relation to hunting and trapping rights. His paper is a must-read for anyone seriously interested in the topic. An aside on Eleanor Burke Leacock. It is more than a little ironic that her study of the Montagnais Naskapi nations in Labrador have become an exhibit supporting the hypothesis that property rights evolve in the way that Demsetz describes, because Leacock was enamored with Marxian economics. This was back in the day when the intelligentsia almost universally accepted Marxian economics, and all it implied, as the wave of the future. She even wrote the introduction to Friedrich Engels' The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State. She had intended for her work to refute the notion that the concept of property is universal. Like Engels, and like most advocates of an attempt to create a socialist transformation of society, Leacock was born into a wealthy family. I wonder if that phenomenon has been investigated by psychologists. I would speculate that scions of wealthy families are accustomed from birth to looking down on the hoi polloi. Of course, many of them nevertheless feel kindly impulses and want to do something to put their kindly impulses into effect. Wouldn't it be nice, though, if they learned that not looking down on us at all would be better for all of us than for these aristocrats to look down on us with benevolent intentions? Getting back to Professor Demsetz's paper, the basic thesis of this paper can be summarized as follows. Just about any action by any individual in any type of society is going to have some effect, either harmful or beneficial, on a person or person besides the individual taking the action. In a society based on the communal use of a resource, these harmful or beneficial effects will be just someone's tough luck or good luck, respectively, until the cost of doing nothing becomes greater than the cost of incentivizing the person taking the action to take a different action. Bringing to bear a consideration of external effects on the decisions of the actor is called internalization. Internalization typically takes the form of the emergence of a customary or legally enforced property right. As Demsetz states this crucial insight in his paper, property rights develop when the gains from internalization become larger than the costs of internalization. For example, think of a rural agricultural area where the population is sparse. In such circumstances, people would gather and burn whatever fuel was close at hand: wood, dried manure, peats, etc., for purposes of cooking and heating. The fuel, in addition to providing energy for the home, consumes resources that then become unavailable to others, and it produces smoke. Nobody has much of an incentive to do anything about these external effects as long as population remains sparse, because neighboring families are still able to find ample fuel for themselves, and the distant smoke of a few neighbors is not particularly bothersome. But as population becomes denser, the external effects begin to make more of a difference to the neighbors. Eventually it becomes worth it to develop a custom or enact a statute that will internalize the costs. That is, to cause each user of fuel to take into account the effects of their use on others, for example, by limiting or pricing the gathering rights and by making the emission of smoke costly to the emitter. Interestingly enough, internalization would produce the same end result from society's point of view if the gatherer/emitter were to be paid to limit the gatherings/emissions instead of being penalized for not doing so. That is, the end result would be the same either way in terms of the effectiveness of the limitation. This was demonstrated in another important paper that won its author, Ronald Coase, a Nobel Prize in Economics, in a 1960 paper titled The Problem of Social Cost. While we were on the subject of property, we should mention one particularly obnoxious example of ecnarongi, that is, ignorance in reverse, that you encounter frequently, which is the notion that the property is the asset itself. For example, a building. However, if you analyze the statement, "I own this building," you should see that what it really means is, I have the exclusive right to use this building until I transfer that right to someone else, for example, in return for a promise to pay rent under a leasing arrangement or by transferring title. Property is about the relationships among people, not about the relationships of people to buildings and the like. What it also does not mean is that the building has rights. I'm surprised I have to point this out, but you have probably encountered and will encounter again mindless rallying cries such as human rights, not property rights. I suppose rallying cries don't really have to make sense as long as they accomplish the goal of rallying, But this slogan is especially ludicrous. To distinguish between human rights and property rights is simply nonsensical, because the right to property is a human right, and up there in importance, just behind the right to life and the right to liberty. Another frequently encountered notion is that property is theft. I believe there actually is a rationale behind this slogan, although the rationale falls apart if you examine it closely. It is certainly possible to gain property by an act of theft, and history is not lacking in examples. But the idea that all property has been gained by acts of theft, or the idea that obtaining exclusive rights to the use of property constitutes theft itself because of the exclusive part, we're getting a little silly. These are ideas that make sense only within ivory towers. So until someone figures out a way to make common ownership, coupled with sharing, work in practice, the choice is stark. Would you rather live in a society where the problem of scarcity is dealt with by waiting in lines or by forced rationing? Or would you rather live in a society where the problem of scarcity is dealt with by contractual arrangements based on property rights and a pricing system? Many thanks to Ms. Camilla for this thoughtful essay. I invite you to have a look at the next essay coming on the Fascinating YouTube channel. Please recommend Fascinating to your friends if you find the lessons from nature in these essays personally valuable, and give it a like. Thanks to Track Tribe for allowing the use of their song, Helium. Live long and prosper. Savor your experiences. Treasure your memories. Anticipate a happy and rewarding future. And respect nature's wisdom.